Folks, that we're honored and pleased to have Jim Walsh, who currently serves as the policy director for Food and Water Watch. And in this capacity, Jim works with Food and Water Watch's policy experts and national allies to develop and implement campaigns to mobilize the public and educate decision makers on strategies that move forward the organization's priorities. Jim Walsh has over 2 decades of experience working in local and national movements to empower communities to work for social, environmental, and economic justice. And while at Food and Water Watch, he has led efforts to overseen numerous campaigns focusing on priorities such as banning fracking, labeling genetically engineered foods, ending water privatization, as well as pushing back on the fossil fuel industry, pushing back on fossil fuel industry backed false solutions to the climate crisis, including carbon pricing, offsets, carbon capture, hydrogen, and factory farm biogas. And I'll just mention here, Jim explains he first found his passion for social justice when he started volunteering for the Milwaukee Catholic workers while earning a degree in economics from Marquette University. And he then followed that with organizing fellowship with the New Jersey Public Interest Research Group at Rutgers University, and went on to work with Family Promise, organizing communities of faith on issues of poverty and homelessness. And he was doing that work for a while, and then he joined as program director the New Jersey Citizen Action, where he oversaw statewide campaigns focused on a variety of issues. So what I'll say or add is, I've had the pleasure of seeing and collaborating with Jim in the context of the people versus fossil fuels. And I find that he's one of the folks who understands why faith-based advocates are an important part of the conversation. So we're deeply pleased to have him. And with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Jim. Thanks so much, Jim.
Well, hello, everybody. And thank you, Pablo, for that warm introduction and warm welcome. Thank you all for being here today and taking time to discuss the Farm Bill and what's going on with it. I think that this is one of the most important policies that our country takes up every 5 years. And so I'm glad we can have this conversation, because this conversation is happening now in Washington, D.C. And for this policy to be something that's going to help improve the climate, improve sustainable agriculture, we need to have people all over the country engaged in this work. And so I'm so glad to be here today with leaders from the Unitarian Universals that are engaged in these efforts in their communities, and hope to be able to engage with all of you in the future going forward. And so I'm going to share my screen here real quick. And let's see here. You should have a slide deck in front of you. And so we're going to talk about how big agricultural interests in the fossil fuel industry are really looking to use the Farm Bill to promote climate scams and further exploitation of our food and farm system. And when we talk about this, some of the stuff might be, I'm going to kind of give a basic overview of the Farm Bill and what it is and kind of things to look for, talk about some specifics on some of the scams that are being pushed forward and the interplay between the fossil fuel industry and the Farm Bill, and how we can use policies in the Farm Bill to build a better food system and to actually fix the climate crisis and to avoid these pitfalls where big agricultural interests in the fossil fuel industry are trying to drag us down. And so first, I want to make the point really clear that agriculture and climate change are connected, and agriculture can be a driver of climate change, and it can be also a tool to help create more sustainable agricultural practices that will actually reduce overall emissions in our society. But climate change also impacts agriculture as well and can cause significant damage to crops. We've seen massive flooding in the Midwest, flood out huge sections of crops in recent years. We've seen droughts in the Pacific or in the Southwest that are worse than at times when the Dust Bowl was here. It's actually the worst drought we've experienced in 1,200 years. And that also, so climate change also impacts our agriculture as well. And we've seen big events costing literally billions of dollars in economic losses that come from these climate change events that have happened in the US. And the major driving force of climate damage in our food system is really factory farming and monoculture dominated agriculture. And our food system and the Farm Bill as it's set up right now is set up in a way to support more monoculture dominated agriculture and more factory farming, which will drive more climate change. And talk a little bit about what we can do in the Farm Bill to actually push back on those developments and the efforts that are actually going to increase significant amounts of pollution from in our waterways and our air and pollutants that warm our planet as well. And so when we look at the Farm Bill, the real, I think, basic things here is this is a very big package that spends literally hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars setting funding for ag and food policy. And there are several titles that are attached to the Farm Bill, and it comes up every 5 years. And these titles here, these are from the 2018 Farm Bill. The titles for the Farm Bill have not been released yet this year, but will probably be coming out soon. And these titles are the different areas where different things will be covered. You'll note that some of these are highlighted here, and those are the ones that we typically pay a little bit closer attention to because of their role that they actually play in our food system. And in particular, some of the commodity markets and energy markets that we're very concerned with organizationally. And in the politics of the Farm Bill, the Farm Bill itself was created in the 20s as this idea that we are going to start making investments in our food policy here in the United States. And in order to get the support that was necessary for the Farm Bill, urban legislators who did not have farming in their areas needed incentive to do that. And because the urban legislators are like, why am I going to vote to give a bunch of money to your districts? What do we get out of this? And that's really what helped develop the SNAP programs, or some people refer to them as food stamps. And these are, historic resources that are actually the largest title in the Farm Bill in terms of overall spending. But it's also created a dynamic where a lot of the urban districts, when they think about the Farm Bill, their primary issue is these SNAP programs, these safety net programs, which are very important because there are many people in our country, as we all know, who cannot afford basic needs like food. And these safety net programs help those families to make ends meet. And they're in danger of being weakened and taken away. But because of that, the other parts of the Farm Bill, the other titles of the Farm Bill, the outside of the nutrition programs don't get a lot of that same energy that would come from urban districts, which tend to be more progressive and tend to be more likely to challenge corporate interests than some of the more rural districts in the country. And what we're talking about here is the corporate interests that have ingrained themselves into our food system take advantage of that dynamic. And so a lot of the big discussions we'll have in the Farm Bill are around, well, how much money are we giving to SNAP programs? How much money is going to food stamps? And we sometimes lose some of these larger systemic conversations that should be happening amongst the broader public. Senator Stabenow is retiring this year. That's a big deal. She really wants to pass the Farm Bill this year. The politics, though, in the Senate and the House are going to make that very difficult. But there will be a lot of pressure coming from Stabenow to move this, which means we're going to see bipartisan compromises And typically what happens right now is the bipartisanship in Congress tends to be the corporate bipartisanism. And so a compromise on the Farm Bill that happens this year very well could be mean that we've kind of made more compromises in certain policies that we wouldn't want to see. The House has a tremendous amount of leverage right now with the Republicans in control of that, who are also controlled largely by a very conservative right-wing bloc of Republicans. Who, because of procedural moves, are in a position to challenge the speaker at the drop of a hat if they so choose to do so. Secretary Vilsack and President Biden also have a role to play in the Farm Bill. President Biden signs it, but they definitely are involved in the negotiations and discussions of this. And Secretary Vilsack, at a hearing 2 weeks ago, actually spoke at this House Agri Committee hearing. And at that hearing, he was reading almost verbatim, it seemed like, from industry talking points of how to make it sound like you're doing something for the climate when really what you're doing is propping up corporate agricultural interests. And it was very concerning to have him say that. And there's a litany of special interests that are involved in this, in the process of the Farm Bill, including coalitions like the ones we're working with, but also the big agricultural interest as well. And the fossil fuel interest are participating aggressively in the Farm Bill. And the core issue that when we think about our food system and where the problems come from, is this idea that we're putting forward bad policies that are encouraging overproduction that prop up factory farming, and is really about growing food and feed, not about growing food for people in particular. And so that model that our agriculture system is based on is bad for the climate, but that model is also very profitable to a lot of corporations. And so those corporations are now trying to figure out, well, how can we make ourselves the solution to the climate crisis? And what can we do to make that happen? While to continue to encourage overproduction and prop up factory farms. And so we have this really broken food system that produces a lot of corn and a lot of soy and a lot of really cheap grain that we feed to pigs and cows and chickens, but not the food that we need to grow our foods. And then we all have coming into that space the fossil fuel industry. And they are pushing carbon offsets. And this is a really important intersection between the big agricultural interest and the fossil fuel industry and how they play together in this environment. And a little background on offsets and what they are. It's a general idea that you can get something for doing something that someone else has done. And so I think this graphic knows this really well, is the general idea that, well, if I'm going to throw a bunch of trash over here, I can pay some money to put up garbage cans downtown, and that somehow gets rid of the problem I created by dumping my trash in this river or my neighbor's yard or whatever it is. And so that's what all these offset schemes are generally premised on, that if you do something good over here, it makes up for whatever bad thing you did over there. It's kind of like this karmic, retribution type idea. But the reality is it doesn't work that way. And so there's some real issues with how this works, and what the fossil fuel industry and the agricultural industry are trying to do is to bring together. They're saying, well, here's agricultural practices that we can do that are going to actually help the climate. And so if we do these agricultural practices, then fossil fuel interests can give us money to do these practices that'll sequester carbon. And then those fossil fuel interests can continue to emit CO2 and methane in the atmosphere without worrying about it, because we're doing something better on the ag space and everything's net zero. The reality is that it just doesn't work that way. There are some fundamental issues that are unable to be addressed really in any meaningful way to actually stop to make offset works. And one is permanence. And permanence is the idea that you would permanently sequester CO2 in biological sources in order to then justify the emissions of fossil fuels elsewhere, or of greenhouse gases elsewhere. But those greenhouse gases that come from fossil fuels are permanent emissions. Those emissions were previously sequestered for millions of years in the soil, but now are being released from the earth, from these factories and smokestacks. Whereas CO2 that is sequestered in a tree or a plant is only sequestered, or in the soil is only sequestered for a very relatively short period of time, sometimes as few as a few days or hours, or maybe as long as a couple hundred years in the case of some trees. But as we saw earlier last year, there was a massive fire in the Pacific Northwest that burned down a whole bunch of trees that were supposed to be carbon offsets for a cap and trade program in California. And so those emissions were released in the atmosphere, and but the polluters had already purchased their credit and were already able to justify their emissions that they had made earlier, and have no accountability to the permanence of those emissions. So on the whole, we're actually increasing overall emissions, even though through accounting tricks, it looks like we're bringing emissions down, or at least reaching a standard of net zero. Additionality is an important consideration, and this is the idea that what somebody is doing is actually would not have happened anyways. And there was a recent study that came out from The Guardian. It was really good a few weeks ago, that actually documented that 95% of the tropical forest offsets that are being sold are non-additional. So the activities that people are embarking in are activities that would have happened anyways had this program not happened. So then polluters and others are able to buy these credits and say, oh, I am reducing emissions by doing this. But the reality is you're paying somebody to do something they would have done anyway. So there's no actual emission and reductions, no change in behavior. What you're really doing is just getting a warm, fuzzy feeling while you continue to emit fossil fuels or emissions from fossil fuels. Corruption is something else we've seen. We've seen a lot of in these carbon markets where people have developed fake credits, sold them on markets. And it's very difficult to verify the veracity of credits in general because of the permanence and additionality issue. And that's actually making it hard to develop markets for carbon. But the industry is driving to move forward carbon markets really aggressively, and they're using the USDA to do that. And we have these carbon markets that exist already in the United States in some way, or carbon offset programs. And so this is not the only, what we're talking about now is not something that's a new concept, but something that is going and is actually ingrained in the Paris Climate Agreement. It's something that that the parties at the Paris Climate Agreement agreed to set up a system of international offsets and carbon trading in order to reach climate goals. And there is an effort to actually establish what those standards would be between various countries and industries to be able to meet those standards. We have regional cap and trade programs in the Northeast called RGGI, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, and the California Cap and Trade Program, or two other programs. Washington State recently set one up, cap and trade program. Currently, right now, climate smart agriculture is the buzzword that's being pushed, and something we need to be very considerate of, because climate smart agriculture doesn't actually mean anything. It is a marketing term that's being used right now by the industry to actually justify certain agricultural practices as being climate smart. And so I want to give you an example that one of the things that the industry is pushing is this idea of no-till agriculture. And so when you think about no-till agriculture, you're like, oh, well, if we're not tilling, then we're not pulling up soil that then would decompose and release more CO2 in the atmosphere. One, it's questionable about how much CO2 you can actually sequester through that process. But two, what that really means is big commodity crops are able to generate carbon offsets or carbon benefits or climate smart stickers, depending on how USDA develops this program, this climate smart agriculture program, that would give them the ability to claim a certain carbon benefit for not tilling. But what they are actually doing is using large amounts of herbicides, broad spectrum herbicides like Roundup, to kill anything that grows, and using large amounts of fossil fuel based fertilizers to spread on those fields. And so you wind up using more fertilizers and more herbicides than you might use otherwise from using more traditional agricultural practices and not these big monoculture models. But this is a way that they're capturing that idea that we can be part of the climate crisis by propping up their standard of agriculture and also finding new sources of income for that through offsets or marketing schemes that the USDA would adopt. The Growing Climate Solutions Act is legislation that passed Congress last year in December at the end of the year, along with the Sustain Us Act. Both of these passed literally the week of Christmas when no one was paying attention. People were celebrating with their families over the holidays. And the Growing Climate Solutions Act sets up a network of third-party verifiers that will verify whether or not somebody has done a practice to sequester CO2 in the soil and give them a little check mark for doing this thing and say, you have done the thing. The Sustains Act is also particularly concerning. What this does is it actually allows any agricultural producers, large agricultural producers, to make investments in conservation programs that the federal government runs, which at its face sounds good. Okay, these are free donations coming from corporations, but they're not giving it away for free. What it actually does is it then has the USDA needs to match those funds in the programs. And so some of the conservation programs and other programs that we have right now are not on their face entirely good. So we'll talk a little bit about some of those programs that are problematic in a little bit. But if the big agricultural interests are able to divert resources towards programs that are going to prop up the big factory farms and prop up the monoculture agricultural practice, that means there's less conservation money available for more sustainable farming practices and less resources to go into those places. So there's actually this bill actually allows big ag to really direct money that would be spent by USDA in agricultural investments. And then another type of offset program are clean energy standards. Some people are familiar with the concept of renewable energy credits. It's another type of offset. It allows utilities essentially to, instead of building renewable energy, to purchase credits that were generated by other renewable energy producers, like people who put solar panels on their roof. And that's another type of offset that also has a whole litany of problems and issues with it, which we can talk about another time. And so together, what we're seeing is big ag and fossil fuels are really pushing this agenda of corporate control that's driving climate disaster. And we're seeing the production control. These are really kind of like 5 areas we're going to talk a little bit more in depth: production control, consolidation, the overall profiteering that we're seeing, the bioenergy schemes, and the fossil fuel fertilizers that are coming pretty aggressively right now. And so production control is something that big ag and fossil fuel interests both do. They do it in slightly different ways, but they do it by restricting supply or overproduction. And so many people have probably heard of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Sometimes it's mentioned in the media, where the federal government will release oil or purchase oil in order to buoy prices so that consumers are not impacted at the pump because of fluctuations in commodity markets. The grain reserve, up until the 90s, was a predominant way that the federal government did that same thing with commodity crops. And what they did was, when the price of corn was low, the federal government would purchase it, and that would restrict supply and push prices up so that farmers could get a fair price for their corn. When prices were high, the federal government would sell that grain back into the marketplace so that consumers were not pinched by high food prices. And they worked to keep grain prices at a level that would be affordable, that would help farmers to be able to make ends meet and also help control prices for consumers. The grain reserve was gotten rid of, and now we have what are basically insurance programs and emergency payments to farmers. And so what this does is it actually drives overproduction. And by driving, what happens is a farmer who plants a lot of corn knows they're going to get paid for that corn that they grow. And so no matter what it is, so there's an incentive to produce a lot of it. And then what happens is you get this food system that incentivizes these big commodity crops like corn and soy, which are then protected by essentially handouts from the federal government to farmers rather than having the grain reserve. But that keeps prices low. So the factory farms and the big food processors who process that soy and corn into consumer goods are able to get really cheap prices for their food inputs. And then they capture the profits, turn those into global commodities that are then shipped around the world as various products filled with preservatives and other unhealthy things that we see. There's new markets and global supply is another way that the industry is works to restrict supply or increase supply. There's going to be a fight this year about country of origin labeling in meat and whether or not we should have that so that people can be assured that they're actually at least buying US produced meat and not meat produced someplace else that looks like it's produced in the US because it has a USDA stamp of approval on it, but is actually from another country. The fossil fuel industry uses global markets to increase exports. The Biden administration has just approved literally a few hours ago more exports from the United States out of the Willow project in Alaska. And so we're going to see far more LNG, now liquefied natural gas, flowing out of the country. And what that does is it actually depletes domestic supply of oil and gas and then pushes supply up on consumers. And then, and the agricultural risk and price loss coverage are the policies that I'd mentioned before were used instead of the grain reserve. And we've seen consolidation has gotten significantly worse in the food sector, and particularly in the meat packing industry. We're seeing tremendous amounts of consolidation that's been happening, particularly you can see in the beef and hog, but this is the meat. These are the market share of the top 4 firms. So we're seeing in the 80s is about 30%. In 2018, it's up to 8, or 2017, it was up to 83 and 66% for beef and hog, respectively. Seeing the same sort of consolidation that's happened where farmers buy their products from. So the inputs they get, the seeds, and the chemical inputs and the fertilizers are coming from fewer and fewer suppliers that control all of the inputs that farmers use and have available to them for their to grow their food. And then we're also seeing it on the other end where the consumer shops, tremendous consolidation in supermarkets, where we're seeing Walmart is a major dominator of the food system, but they aren't the only ones there. And as a whole, the top 4 producers control 65% of the market. And that's a considerable amount of consolidation. And you know, for folks who are like, well, is consolidation necessarily bad? I think one of the lessons that we've recently learned is what consolidation happened in the baby formula sector, where one supplier of baby formula had to take their product offline because of safety concerns. And it caused a nationwide disruption in baby formula access. And it wasn't just for the people who produced that, who used that sort of baby formula, because then those folks were looking for other sorts of baby formula and people weren't able to find what they needed. So it became a big problem. The fossil fuel industry is also producing these fossil fuel fertilizers. And the process this goes through is they literally take fracked gas and then they turn it into hydrogen through this process called steam methane reformation. And where they take the fracked gas, they put it under in a very moist, high humidity environment under pressure and heat, and it creates hydrogen. It literally breaks the methane atom apart, which is CH4 into carbon and hydrogen, and then the carbon forms with oxygen and creates CO2. The industry then says, well, what we're going to do is we're going to take carbon capture technology and put it on the hydrogen technology, let alone the fact that carbon capture technology doesn't work, hasn't worked, hasn't been shown to work, and there's no indication it's going to start working, but they're going to use this magical technology to capture the CO2 from the hydrogen and call that blue hydrogen. Then they're going to further manipulate the hydrogen to produce ammonia, which can be used as a fertilizer for crops. And this is a major new market that the fossil fuel industry is looking to tap really aggressively, and very well could be getting a lot of support in the Farm Bill this year for the development of what they're calling blue ammonia, and the fossil fuel industry calls a low carbon fertilizer. And a lot of the big agricultural producers call it that as well. And they call it a low carbon fertilizer because they capture the CO2 in the process of producing hydrogen. One of the things that's very interesting about that is there was research that came out that showed that producing that hydrogen for energy with the CCS is actually worse than burning coal. It's so carbon intensive. So you're creating a tremendous amount of greenhouse gases through this connection. They're also going to be pushing significant bioenergy schemes. And these bioenergy schemes are where a lot of the offsets are going to come from. The ethanol and CO2, there's these big ethanol plants where they ferment corn to create ethanol, and they want to capture the CO2 and they want to put it into pipelines. They're going to move from Iowa to North Dakota and then use that captured CO2 for oil drilling in North Dakota. It's the primary of all the carbon capture projects that exist in the United States. All except for one are used for oil drilling. And there's a tremendous amount of old extracted oil wells up in the Dakotas that they will probably use as CO2 for once it gets up there. Although they say that they're not sure what they're going to use it for. But that's where they're bringing it. Factory farm gas is another bioenergy scheme that's been produced. And this is something we'll talk a little bit more about in depth. And then biorefineries are a new area that's coming out where we're actually seeing now that oil refineries that have been shuttered and taken offline are now coming back online as bioenergy refineries. And so all of the communities where these biorefineries are now being placed are the same places where they were before. They're environmental justice communities, or communities that are overburdened with pollution. And now they're having this new refinery being replaced here that the industry is touting as a clean energy, carbon-free solution. Even if that were true, which it doesn't seem like it is, you're also creating more sacrifice zones and more harm and harmful air pollution in these biorefineries that are going to be making bioenergy for various uses that might make us feel good about what we're doing, but at the end of the day are causing a lot of harm to air quality, water quality, and probably our climate as well. And so biogas is this really biggest scam. And this is one of the biggest things that we're trying to tackle right now in the Farm Bill and in general. And this is factory farming is the major driver of climate change. And it is the major driver, and it's coming from methane or from factory farms. It is now being used to greenwash this pollution. And so the industry is literally capturing the manure from these big dairies and factory farms, using that manure to actually put it into an anaerobic environment, an environment where you don't have oxygen, which then produces methane. And then they capture that methane and they say, look, we have this amazing new fuel that we can use that we captured that otherwise would have went in the atmosphere, because methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. And so they say, well, we captured this, it didn't go in the atmosphere, so we can burn it now and it's okay because we're actually benefiting the climate. But what they're doing is they're forgetting that factory farm waste is not a foregone conclusion. We don't need to have factory farms. We don't need to have all this poop, and we don't need to have all this methane. They don't actually get rid of the waste. The poop is still there, the pathogens are still there, and all the other nitrates and nitrogens are still there, which are the predominant pollutant in our waterways in the United States. And so it can actually increase the ability of these nitrates to pollute waterways. So it actually makes it more likely that we're going to see nitrates and nutrients in our waterways. It's also very difficult to operate. They're expensive. And they can only be used on big farms. So the entities that are benefiting from these factory farms are the biggest farms and the biggest factory farms. And not only do they benefit from selling their biogas, but they benefit from selling the carbon offsets. And we're at a point now where some farms are actually coming online and not looking to produce milk as much as they're looking to produce methane. And the milk that they're producing is an afterthought. The milk is almost a byproduct, and the methane is the actual product that they're producing, because these offset schemes make it so profitable for them to do so. And it's very expensive. This is going to drive up cost on consumers, and it's going to really cause prices to go up in general. And this is the same is true with ethanol production. Ethanol is very expensive. It drives up not just fuel prices, but it also drives up food prices by as much as 20% because so much land is dedicated to ethanol production. And so we'll essentially continue to drive up cost and entrench these dirty factory farms. And so we can make these systems better. It isn't totally like all doom and gloom, but we need to push back on some of these things and start pushing for things that are going to do things like integrate crop and livestock together, so that we're having more cattle grazing where you don't have big piles of literally cesspools of manure that produce methane, but manure that would be incorporated into the soil, into a field. We can look at, we've seen how sustainable farming practice and conservation programs can actually reduce cost for farmers and improve soil health overall, which then means fewer chemical fertilizers, fewer other herbicides and pesticides that might need to be used. In order to push this forward, we formed an alliance this year called the Alliance Against Farm Bill Offsets. And the Unitarian Universalists for Social Justice had joined this along with a number of other organizations. These are the original 60 groups who formed the other organizations. We're up to about 90 now. Organizations that literally make up healthcare professionals, scientists, farmers, indigenous organizations, people of faith, consumer organizations, and a wide variety of individuals who see that offsets are actually driving so many problems with the Farm Bill and actually creating these problems. They're driving consolidation because the big farms are the ones who benefit from these offsets. They're driving the factory farm development and the biogas and the climate change because they're the ones, because they're pretending as though these things are going to help the climate when we're seeing is they're making it worse, as well as creating a lot of other environmental justice issues. And so in a bigger farm bill, the top line giveaways in the better farm bill would be opposing offsets and bioenergy, opposing fossil fuel fertilizers and these programs that promote overuse of fertilizers, programs that support overproduction. So getting rid of these emergency payments to farmers and looking to move back into policies that will support farmers through the grain reserves and those sorts of steps. And working to oppose consolidation. And when I say oppose consolidation, that's also tightening and enforcing antitrust laws. The administration right now has a significant ability to actually come in and do more enforcement of antitrust laws and break up some of these monopolies, but they're not doing it. They don't need a farm bill to do that. We need to decouple the conservation programs from the private so that the big agricultural interests aren't able to direct public funding to their pet projects, which will also generate offsets that they can sell into offset markets. Programs that really look at the wages for farmers and farm workers. We have a significant rural poverty in this country, and we are not paying farmers and farm workers very much at all. But what we are doing is building up these big, huge corporations that are making record profits off the backs of our farmers, and all of us paying higher prices at the grocery store. And look at really regional and traditional indigenous farming and traditional farming methods that have worked for decades, and learn from those things, relearn some of the practices that we've forgotten, and fully fund the conservation programs. These are the programs that can actually help support organic farming, sustainable farming. But right now, some of those conservation programs also divert money to biogas. So we need to make sure that those conservation programs are not just fully funded, but funding the right things. And so thank you very much for your time. And with that, I'll take questions. And
Yep. Thank you so much, Jim. I really appreciate you coming and talking to us and sharing with us some of the complexity that's embedded in the Farm Bill. So I'm just going to, we're going to stay on time. So we have only just a little bit of time for questions, but I want to ask you if you could talk for a few moments about what is the difference, or what do you want people to know about how regenerative farming plays into all of this? I mean, you talked about climate smart being a buzzword used on one side of the ledger. But there are a lot of folks who are really eager to see how we can use regenerative farming and pushing back on some of this complexity and systemic difficulty.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and we are seeing a lot of farm washing, for lack of a better word, where big companies are actually coming up with their own regenerative agricultural standards and saying this is what regenerative agriculture is, and then giving themselves kudos for doing things that they were doing anyways, or maybe doing things that are furthering the consolidation model and not supporting more sustainable local and regional food systems. And so when we think about some of these programs, I'd say that the areas we really want to fund are the major conservation programs. That's where a lot of the regenerative money is going to come from. The resources to help farmers to rebuild their soil and take care of these things. And I think that we need to be very careful when we use some of these buzzwords, in what we're talking about, because they're not really defined in law. And everybody has a picture in their head that's like, oh, regenerative agriculture, that sounds great. But regenerative agriculture means a lot of different things to a lot of different people in different places. And really, we should be, looking at the conservation programs that fund healthy soils, that help farmers to protect their fields and help support more things like regional food hubs that are going to give resources for sustainable farmers and markets for sustainable farmers to sell their products and to get into markets that are largely captured by big agricultural interests in our big grocery stores.
Now, I want to remind folks, I neglected to mention, if you want to ask the question yourself, because we were recording, then you sort of get the privilege of getting your question asked. But so is there anybody who wants to ask the question themselves? If so, please raise your electronic hand and then I'll recognize you. And while you're mulling that over, somebody asked, can you talk about the dynamic of Bill Gates purchasing farms and what that signals about the direction of farm ownership?
Yeah, there's a lot of concern with land grabs going on right now, and what that does mean. I think that we're largely very concerned with this sort of purchasing of land, and what I think is potentially happening in that is that they're looking at the potential for future markets for carbon and looking to cash in on that. But I don't know what Bill Gates, overall motivation is. I haven't spoke to him or looked into what his stated desire is for doing that. But we've seen foreign governments looking at buying farmland, which is also can be concerning when a key national resource is controlled by any large entity, be it a country or a company or a billionaire. We should all be generally concerned with the control of those resources, I would think.
Thank you, Jim.
I see a couple of other questions here, which I can just hop into if you want me to do that.
Sure, go for it. So
yeah, I think we could switch from animal based, yeah, we absolutely I've been vegan for, I guess, about 14 years now. I haven't advocated for anything vegan in my talk today at all. And I don't think we actually need everyone to go vegan in order to create a better food system. But we need to stop doing what we're doing right now. I would be willing to bet that most of the people that are vegan today probably wouldn't have been vegan if we did not have this factory farm method of agriculture that is abusing animals in a massive scale, that has driven so many people to say, I am stepping away from that entire thing, entire meat industry as a whole. And so I think that while there's benefits to doing it, the idea that we're going to vegan our way to a better food system I think is also somewhat naive. The big agricultural producers and the factory farm owners are going to ship their meats all over the world like they're doing now, and they will find markets for it. And so what we need to do is change the way production is happening and do that. And please, if you want to be vegan, go right ahead. I do it. If you don't, that's fine too. But if we want to impact the climate, I think the biggest thing we could do, in the food sector is to shut down the factory farming industry as a whole. And then biogas. So as long as meat is produced, shouldn't we use biogas for energy production? No, absolutely not. There is the biogas from cows is not a foregone conclusion. It is a major source of pollution that is created at factory farms. Small, sustainable farms don't have that same problem. They get poop that they can spread on their fields and help with fertilizer. They're not creating cesspools and concentrations of waste that are creating massive plumes of methane. And also, it's important to recognize that the methane that comes from the manure digesters is only about half of the total methane produced at factory farms. So we're actually seeing the rest of the methane actually comes from enteric emissions, the cow burps from digestion. And so those cow burps actually release significant emissions in the atmosphere that isn't captured. And as we see more consolidation and more profit per cow, we're actually increasing the overall cow burps that are happening. So even though we're maybe capturing more methane, that methane is leaking. The leakage rates within biogas equipment is sometimes as high as 15%, whereas the natural gas system in the country is somewhere probably between 4 and 1%. So we're seeing significant amounts of leakage in that system as well. And then when they sell the credits for offsets, it's even worse because you've embarked in this process, which is increasing overall emissions, claiming a reduction in emissions, and somebody else can use that to justify their own emissions. And so I see no reason why we should be encouraging biogas production from factory farms in any way, shape, or form. In the United States. India, I haven't studied what's going on in India, but I can't imagine that there aren't better ways to do things than burning a bunch of manure for cows. Yeah, so the study on blue hydrogen, so that was Howarth and Jacobson, Howarth from Cornell and Jacobson from Stanford, and I believe it's titled "How Green is Blue Hydrogen," and it's a great study, very easy, not too complicated, really good graphics in it.
So
John Peterson's got his hand up.
yeah, so we don't have too many questions in the chat after that one, but I want to just zip through the people who have their hands raised since I opened that box. So John Peterson, please, and then Mary.
Yeah, I just felt like I would like to see a lot of the details that are behind some of the assertions that got made. Studies got mentioned here and there. If you could produce a list of those studies, I would really like to go through that.
What I can do, John, is I can put together some materials and background things we have, where we have fact sheets that where all these came from, which are very well sourced, and each one probably has somewhere between 40 and 80 different citations on them. I'd be more than happy to share those with you, and they can all be found on our website as well.
So on that score,
that would be great.
So on that score, Jim will get those to me and then we'll circulate them. Mary, go for it.
Just quickly, it looks like we need a way to produce animals for consumption that isn't animal-based regenerative agriculture, which doesn't allow for wildlife and habitat to halt and reverse the biodiversity crisis. I've been vegan for 30 years, and I've tried to tell other vegans, look, the world is not going to go vegan overnight, okay? Forget it. It's not going to happen fast enough if it happens at all. And we need a plan B. Can we talk about a plan B? And I know that most indigenous folks eat wild animals. They don't want to domesticate farmed animals. And there's been some conflicts, like in California, the Thule elk are dying of thirst and starvation because the public lands are going to cattle, grass-fed cattle. And I've heard good things and bad things about cell-cultured meats, and I'm wondering if you have anything about the environmental impacts there.
Yeah, I haven't looked into cell-cultured meats specifically, but I have a lot of general concerns about them. And I think a lot of them come from, this is another kind of techno fix to a food system that is broken, that isn't going to actually address any of the underlying issues we have in our food system at the end of the day. And the underlying issues is that we have big corporations that make decisions on what we're going to eat that happens long before it gets to our fork. And so I don't see that being a small producer model, that's coming out here. I see it as being more opportunities for consolidation, and another way to, really just, I think maybe give people the idea of hope that, oh, well, we're going to just deliver this new thing in the future and we'll eventually get there. The reality is the climate crisis is bearing down on us now. We cannot wait for some technological thing to go away, especially when we know the solutions are there and within our grasp. And the real thing we need to start doing is legislation like the Farm System Reform Act that Representative Khanna and Senator Booker introduced, that will put a moratorium on new factory farms and phase them out in a just way over a 20-year period, so that we don't continue to have those in existence anymore, as opposed to letting the market figure it out for us. Because all the market's going to figure out is who's going to make the most money for selling what. It's not going to figure out how to make a sustainable planet. It's not going to figure out how to make a just and equitable food system.
Thanks so much, Jim, for that answer. So we're going to blaze through these, John, Peter, and try to keep your questions succinct, because I promised Jim to get him out of here at the top of the hour.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for taking my question, and I guess I'll continue the trend of vegans asking questions. So I'm coming at this from the vegan lens, but I'm going to be a little contrarian here about some things that I've read about CAFOs versus organic grazed cattle. CAFO animals tend to be on the feedlot for about 6 months before they're slaughtered. The grazed animals, the organic meat that everybody says, oh, I eat organic meat, those cows don't grow as fast as the cows in the feedlot, and they actually live to about 1.5 years before they're slaughtered. So they're burping for, much more lifespan than the ones on the CAFO. So I don't know if you've seen that, heard that, have any feedback on that.
I think one of the things that's important to consider in all these things, and this is something I've seen the industry try to get us to do generally as the public, is to focus on a really narrow piece of the picture and then not think about anything else, right? So is that cow if you only took the time the cow was alive and burping versus the time it wasn't, and let's say you capture all that, then is the problem go away? And the reality is the problems with factory farms are not just at the factory farm, right? It's the massive system of soy and corn that we're growing just to feed animals, right? That is carbon intensive. That uses that's where all these fossil fuel fertilizers are going to be spread, being called climate smart commodities, right? These are the sorts of things that I think what we need to do is say, okay, step back and look at the big picture and say, well, what is, if we look at all these things coming together, what is actually better? And our food system right now is actually, there's conscious policies in place that prohibit us from taking that big picture look. So for instance, the Environmental Protection Agency is prohibited from asking farms about their emissions of greenhouse gases. Every year, there is a bill that passes with the appropriation for the Environmental Protection Agency that says they are not able to spend any money asking factory farms about their emissions. And so forget measuring them. They're not even allowed to ask. So how do we get a full picture of any of these things while these restrictions on basic information are being put forward every year by Congress as a matter of regular business? And so I think, when I think about these issues of, is it better to graze a cattle? Is it better to do that? We should be thinking about that, but we should be thinking about the whole picture and not just these narrow pieces. Because I think when it all gets added up, it all adds up in a lot of different ways. And it isn't just the carbon dioxide, right? It isn't just the methane. The only problems with animal agriculture are not just the greenhouse gases. And so I think I would just think that looking at the full picture of this is something we should do. And we should be asking these questions, but be very wary of these kind of one-off facts that come forward and say, this is why this is better for the climate versus something else, or worse for the climate versus something else.
And finally, with great warmth, Peter's question, since he raised his hand. Go for it, Peter. You're on mute right now.
To narrow the focus again and come back to the burp question, could you contrast, if possible, and if known, the greenhouse gas emissions from cow burps in feedlots and factory farms versus pastured animals?
I don't know if they burp more in the factory farm or in the pasture. And there are things out there, like Burger King, I think it was Burger King. They made this commercial that was totally bonkers about them. It's if I find it, I'll send it to Pablo to send everybody, but it's this short 2-minute cartoon about how great it is that they're controlling farm burps by feeding seaweed to cows. And it's just like, and it's this idea that somehow we're going to do this thing that's going to reduce cow burps, and all of a sudden factory farms is a sustainable model. And so I think just, whatever those numbers are, like the whole system is broken.
Yeah.
And so we do something that makes a tweak over here and a tweak over there. It's just trying to pull on people's climate heartstrings to allow them to kind of get distracted with, these new shiny toys that we'll all have that are really, the same old thing that we've gotten before, and with the same old problems that come along with it.
Okay, thank you.
And with that, Jim, I want to thank you. I know you're actually on vacation, so we want to let you get back to your family and your kin that have graciously lent you to us this evening. In our tradition at UUSJ, I will linger to answer, questions to the best of my ability as a poor stand-in, but nevertheless, I will be here, and I'm happy to jawbone with our folks. But I want to invite everybody to say thank you to Jim for his time, and be on the lookout for those fact sheets and other excellent information from UUSJ. And I encourage you to take our UUSJ action on the Farm Bill. So we'll circulate that one too. Thanks again. So now is a chance, if you have any questions about this right here, right now, that we're have going at the moment, what we're planning, what we're thinking. It's a great time to sort of just jawbone with Pablo for a couple of minutes.
Hey,
Those of you-
Pablo, do you think, oh, never mind, forget it.
What's up?
Never,
Oh.
Sally Hand Hartman.
Okay. So I'm going to just stop recording now.